Story number 1.
The wind howled against the windows as Sarah sat on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket. The house was eerily quiet, except for the steady tap of raindrops against the glass and the occasional groan of the old wooden beams shifting with the storm. She had always enjoyed the solitude of these late-night hours, but tonight something felt different. The house seemed to hum with an unsettling energy, as though the walls themselves were alive. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She reached for it, expecting a message from her best friend, but instead, the screen lit up with an unknown number. She hesitated, but curiosity got the best of her, and she answered it. "Hello?" she said, her voice a little shaky. There was only silence on the other end. Sarah frowned, holding the phone to her ear, but the line was dead. A sense of unease crept up her spine. She shrugged it off, telling herself it was probably a wrong number, or a prank. The storm outside was intensifying, and her thoughts returned to the comfort of the warm blanket and the flickering light of the fireplace. Just as she settled back into the couch, she heard something faint, almost like a whisper. At first, she thought it was just the wind playing tricks on her, but the voice grew louder, more distinct. Her heart began to race as she strained to listen. "Sarah?" The voice was soft, almost a sigh, yet filled with an unmistakable sadness. She froze, her name spoken with an unnatural gentleness. She glanced around the room, half expecting someone to step out from the shadows. But there was no one. The room was empty. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of quiet that made her feel exposed. She tried to convince herself that it was just the storm outside, or perhaps the house creaking from age, but deep down she knew something wasn't right. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Sarah stood, her feet cold against the hardwood floor, and walked toward the window. She pulled back the heavy curtains, peering out into the rain-drenched night. The street was empty, bathed in the faint glow of the streetlights, but there was no sign of life. Then something caught her eye. A figure stood across the street, just outside the reach of the light. A woman, pale and gaunt, her hair wet from the rain, clung to the darkness like a shadow. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The figure was motionless, staring straight at her. She could feel its eyes, even though they were obscured by the heavy rain. Her blood ran cold. Without thinking, Sarah stepped back from the window, heart pounding in her chest. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her. Maybe it was a stranger out in the storm, waiting for shelter. But the air around her felt thick, charged with something unseen. She grabbed her phone again, her fingers trembling as she dialed her friend's number. The line rang, then went to voicemail. "Come on, pick up," she whispered to herself. But there was no answer. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly through the house, soft but deliberate. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She slowly turned her head toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The footsteps grew louder, closer. It was impossible. She was alone in the house. The only sound should have been the rain and the wind. And yet, there they were, footsteps coming from somewhere just beyond the hallway. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice quivering. "Is anyone there?" The footsteps stopped. A chill swept through the room, and Sarah felt her skin prickle with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She backed away from the window, slowly moving toward the hallway. Her feet felt as though they were made of lead, heavy and reluctant to move. Her breath was shallow, every muscle in her body tense. She reached the hallway and stopped at the edge, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was silent again. The footsteps had stopped, but the unsettling feeling lingered, thick in the air. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement. There was nothing. But then she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, in the shadows of the dim light, a figure stood. Not the woman outside, but something else. A shape, vaguely human but distorted, as if its form was shifting in the darkness. It was tall and thin, its features hidden by the shadows, but Sarah could feel its presence pressing against her, suffocating her. For a moment she couldn't move, frozen in place as if her body had betrayed her. The figure didn't move, but Sarah could feel its gaze, cold and unfeeling, fixed on her. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get out of the house, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. It wasn't just watching her, it was waiting for something. Suddenly the lights flickered, casting brief shadows across the room. When they returned, The figure was gone. Sarah's heart was racing now, her mind spinning. She rushed to the light switch, flipping it on and off in a desperate attempt to calm herself, but the light stayed steady. The hallway was empty. Nothing moved. But the air was still thick, charged with the energy of something just beyond her perception. A loud bang echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of something or someone moving around. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone again, dialing her friend, but the line still went straight to voicemail. "Please, pick up, please," she whispered under her breath. With a deep breath, Sarah made her decision. She had to check upstairs. Maybe it was just the wind or the house settling, but she couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. She grabbed a flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen and started to climb the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The sound of her footsteps was drowned by the roar of the storm outside, but in the stillness of the house, each creak sounded deafening. She reached the top of the stairs and paused. The hallway stretched before her, lined with closed doors. The noise had stopped and everything was eerily quiet once more. Then she heard it, a whisper, low and soft, coming from the end of the hall. A voice, familiar and chilling. "Sarah." She turned her head toward the source of the sound. The bedroom door at the end of the hall stood ajar, as if someone had left it open on purpose. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Sarah, I'm here." The voice was no longer the soft, sad whisper from before. Now it was cold, full of malice. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, to flee the house, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. Something about the voice, so personal, so familiar, made her hesitate. She took a tentative step toward the door, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound grating against her nerves. Inside, the room was empty. The bed was made, and nothing seemed out of place. But the air was thick, suffocating, and Sarah could feel it, the presence of something unseen. The flashlight flickered. For a split second, she saw it, a pale, gaunt face staring back at her from the reflection in the mirror. The figure, the same one from the hallway, was right behind her. Before she could scream, the light went out. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was one of those nights where the wind howled through the trees and the rain hammered relentlessly against the windows. The kind of night where everything outside was swallowed by darkness, and you couldn't help but feel isolated in the quiet of your home. Jennifer sat alone in her living room, a cup of tea warming her hands, staring out the window at the storm. She had always found solace in the rain. The sound was soothing, comforting even, but tonight it felt different. The house felt different. Every creak of the old wood beneath her seemed louder, more deliberate, as if the house was trying to communicate something she didn't want to hear. Jennifer had moved into the small 2-story house just a few months ago. It was the perfect place for her to settle into after her recent breakup. It was quiet, away from the bustle of city life. Her only neighbor was an elderly woman who lived a few houses down, and Jennifer had only seen her once or twice from a distance. She tried to focus on the comforting warmth of her tea, the smell of lavender and chamomile filling the air, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't leave her. It was like she was being watched, even though the room was empty. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from her best friend, Emily. "How's the storm treating you?" Jennifer smiled and typed a quick reply. "I'm good. Just a little creeped out. It's one of those nights, you know?" As she hit send, the lights flickered. Just for a moment, but it was enough to make her pause. It was a power surge, she assumed. The storm was bad, after all, but there was something about it, something about the way the lights flickered, that made her skin crawl. It felt like more than just a technical glitch. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She put the phone down and stood, walking over to the window to peer out into the rain. Her breath fogged up the glass as she looked into the pitch-black night. The streetlights cast faint halos of light on the slick pavement, and the trees swayed violently in the wind. Nothing seemed out of place. She turned back toward the living room, but as she did, her eyes caught something in the hallway. A shadow. Just for a second, it was there, and then gone, swallowed up by the dark. Jennifer's pulse quickened. She was sure she hadn't seen anything earlier when she walked through the house. But now something was off. Okay, calm down, she whispered to herself. She walked over to the hallway, but the shadow was gone. There was nothing but the empty space at the end of the corridor, the dim light from the living room casting a long shadow across the floor. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her. After all, the storm outside was frightening, and she was alone. Loneliness had a way of distorting your senses. Jennifer took a deep breath and turned back toward the living room, but as she walked back, she heard it, a soft sound like a whisper, barely audible over the storm. Jennifer, her blood ran cold. It was her name, spoken in a voice that wasn't hers. She froze, staring into the darkness of the hallway. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice trembling, her heart racing in her chest. Her feet felt heavy as she stepped forward toward the source of the voice. There was no response. She hesitated, torn between the impulse to run and the need to investigate. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she stepped into the hallway. The air felt different here, chilled, as though the warmth from the living room didn't quite reach this part of the house. It was suffocating. The house creaked again, this time more loudly. She glanced down at the floorboards beneath her feet, feeling the shift in the wood as if something were moving underneath. Suddenly she heard it again, this time closer. "Jennifer." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it came from the stairs. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the staircase leading to the second floor. Her mind raced. There was no one upstairs, she was alone. But the voice sounded so real, so close. Slowly she began to ascend the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. Her hand rested on the banister, the wood smooth but cold to the touch. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the walls as she made her way up. At the top of the stairs, she stood frozen. The house felt still, too still. There was an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of the storm outside. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she looked down the hallway to the rooms beyond. The voice came again, only this time it was clearer. Louder. Jennifer. This time it was coming from her bedroom. Her feet carried her toward the door before she even realized it. She reached for the knob, her hand trembling as she turned it. The door creaked open. The room was dark, save for the faint light from the hallway. The bed was neatly made, as it always was, but something was wrong. The air was thick, colder than the rest of the house, and there, in the corner, was a shadow, a figure standing still. It was a woman. Her hair was long and dark, tangled and wet, as though she had just stepped out of the rain. She stood motionless, facing the wall, her back to Jennifer. The shadows seemed to cling to her like a shroud, making her figure indistinct. "Hello?" Jennifer whispered, her voice barely audible. She took a step forward, her breath shallow. The woman didn't respond. Jennifer reached out, her hand shaking as she moved toward the figure. "Are you okay?" Suddenly, the woman's head jerked to the side, her eyes locking onto Jennifer's with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The woman's face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, as though she hadn't seen daylight in years. Jennifer stumbled backward, a scream lodged in her throat. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. "Jennifer." The voice was right behind her now, cold and raspy, as though it came from somewhere deep within the earth. She whipped around, but the woman was gone. The room was empty. For a moment, Jennifer couldn't move. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. She scrambled to the door, throwing it open, and fled down the hallway, her mind spinning with terror. She reached the stairs, nearly tripping over her own feet as she descended in a panic. When she reached the bottom, she ran straight for the door, flinging it open and stumbling out into the pouring rain. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the keys. The storm soaked through her clothes as she slammed the car door shut and locked it, her heart still racing. She sat there in the car, staring at the house. The lights were off, and everything seemed eerily still. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't over. The woman, the voice, it was just the beginning. Jennifer didn't go back that night. In fact, she never went back. She left the house, leaving behind her life, her belongings, and everything she had once known. The house was sold, but no one ever stayed in it for long. And the voice, the woman in the corner, they stayed there, waiting for the next lonely soul who dared to stay alone at night. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
The rain had been falling for hours, a steady, relentless downpour that turned the streets into rivers and filled the air with a heavy chill. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of Claire's small house on the edge of town. She had always loved the sound of rain, but tonight it felt different, unnerving, almost suffocating. She sat on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, scrolling through her phone. The power had gone out an hour ago, leaving her with only the dim glow of her flashlight and a handful of candles flickering on the coffee table. Her nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and with the storm knocking out cell service, she was completely cut off. Usually she didn't mind the isolation, but tonight a strange unease settled in her chest, making the walls of the house feel too close, the darkness too heavy. Then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tap against the back door. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was probably just the storm. A loose branch, maybe? But the sound came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Her fingers tightened around her phone as she forced herself to stand. She moved toward the kitchen, where the back door was, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. A flash of lightning illuminated the yard for a split second. Something moved. She stopped dead, her heart slamming against her ribs. She pressed her hand against the cool glass of the door's window and peered outside, her breath fogging up the surface. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Then, just as she was about to turn away, the knock came again. This time, it was louder. Her stomach dropped. Someone was out there. "Hello?" She called out, her voice unsteady. No answer. She grabbed the flashlight from the counter and hesitated before unlocking the door. Every instinct screamed at her not to. She took a slow, deep breath and flicked the flashlight on, shining it through the window. For a moment, all she could see was rain and darkness. Then something shifted at the edge of the light. A face, pale, unmoving, eyes sunken and hollow. Claire stumbled backward with a choked gasp. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. Then, as another bolt of lightning flashed across the sky, it was gone. The yard was empty. Claire's breath came in short, ragged bursts. Her hands trembled as she locked the door and backed away. A sudden creak from the hallway made her whirl around. The sound was coming from inside the house. She wasn't alone. The air turned frigid. She aimed the flashlight toward the hallway, the beam cutting through the darkness. The door to her bedroom was slightly ajar. She had left it closed. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of the house, but her feet wouldn't move. A whisper drifted from the darkness. "You're not supposed to be here." Claire's body broke free of its paralysis. She ran. Through the living room, past the flickering candles, her breath coming in desperate gasps. She reached the front door, her fingers fumbling at the lock. Another whisper. Closer. "You shouldn't have come back." She yanked the door open and stumbled out into the rain, the freezing wind slapping against her face. She ran. She didn't look back, not when she heard the creak of footsteps behind her, not when she felt the cold breath on her neck. She ran until she reached her neighbor's house, banging on the door, sobbing, shaking. When they let her in, she collapsed onto the floor, unable to speak. The police found nothing when they searched her home, no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no one there. But Claire knew what she had seen, and she knew without a doubt that it was still in there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The wind howled through the trees, rattling the old window panes as rain lashed against the glass. Rachel sat curled up on the couch, a heavy blanket draped over her shoulders, staring at the dim glow of the television. The storm outside had been raging for hours, and she had lost count of how many times the lights flickered. She lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, a quiet place where nothing much ever happened. It had been her grandfather's home before he passed, and though she had spent the last 2 years living there, it never truly felt like hers. Something about the place had always unsettled her, small noises in the night, strange drafts, the feeling of being watched when she was alone. She tried to brush it off as her imagination, but nights like this made it impossible to ignore. A loud boom of thunder shook the house, making her jump. The power flickered again, and this time it didn't come back on. Darkness swallowed the room. Rachel sighed, fumbling for her phone. No signal, just her luck. The storm must have knocked out the towers. She turned on the flashlight and swept it around the room, the familiar walls and furniture casting eerie shadows. She had plenty of candles, but something about getting up in the dark unsettled her. She sat still for a moment, listening to the house. The wind groaned through the trees, rain pounded the roof, but underneath it all was something else. A soft creak. Her stomach tightened. It had come from the hallway. She wasn't sure why she was afraid. Old houses made noise, wood expanded and shifted. It was nothing. Another creak, closer. Rachel's breath hitched. She turned her flashlight toward the hallway entrance. The beam illuminated the narrow corridor leading to her bedroom. Nothing was there. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. She swallowed hard. Hello? Her own voice sounded small, weak. No answer. Then from the darkness of the hallway, she heard it. Bare feet on wooden floors. A slow, deliberate step. Then another. She sucked in a breath, gripping her phone tightly. She wasn't imagining it. Someone was there. Forcing herself to move, she rose from the couch, heart hammering against her ribs. Her pulse roared in her ears, nearly drowning out the sound of the rain. The footsteps stopped. Rachel held her breath, flashlight trembling in her grip. She didn't want to go down that hallway, but she couldn't just stand there. With cautious steps, she moved forward, light cutting through the darkness. She reached her bedroom door. It was open, just as she had left it. But something felt wrong. The air was colder here. Heavy. She stepped inside. The room was empty. Her bed was unmade, the curtains swayed slightly from the draft, but nothing was out of place. She turned to leave, and froze. The closet door was open. Rachel was sure she had closed it earlier. Positive. Her fingers trembled as she raised the flashlight toward the closet. The beam caught the edges of her hanging clothes, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. Then something moved. Deep inside the closet. Rachel's breath came in short, sharp gasps. She wanted to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But she couldn't move. The darkness inside the closet shifted, and slowly, impossibly, something stepped forward. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light. Then she saw its face. Pale, hollow eyes, mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Her flashlight flickered. The thing took another step. Rachel stumbled backward, her own scream catching in her throat. The light went out. Darkness consumed everything. The whisper came, cold and close. "You're not alone." Rachel bolted. She sprinted through the house, nearly tripping over the coffee table in her blind panic. She clawed at the front door, wrenching it open and bursting into the storm. The rain hit her like ice, but she didn't care. She ran barefoot down the driveway, past the trees, not stopping until she reached the neighbor's house. When they let her in, she collapsed, gasping for breath. She couldn't explain what had happened. She could barely process it herself. The police found nothing when they searched her home. No signs of forced entry, nothing in the closet, but Rachel knew the truth. The house was never truly empty, and she would never be alone again. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the roof as the wind howled through the trees. The power had gone out nearly an hour ago, leaving Emily alone in the dark, the dim glow of her flashlight barely pushing back the oppressive shadows in her small house. She lived on the outskirts of town, in an old home she had inherited from her aunt. The isolation had never bothered her before. She enjoyed the quiet, the space to herself. But tonight, something felt different. A heaviness lingered in the air, a suffocating presence that made the house feel smaller, colder. She sat curled on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, trying to ignore the way the darkness seemed to press against her. The storm was making all sorts of sounds, branches scraping against windows, the occasional distant crack of thunder. But then she heard something else. A soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the back door. Emily froze. The rain was too heavy for it to be a stray branch, and yet the sound had been unmistakable. 3 sharp knocks like knuckles rapping against wood. She swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the flashlight. She wasn't expecting anyone. Not this late, not in this weather. The sound came again. She stood slowly, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor, and moved toward the kitchen where the back door was. Every instinct told her to ignore it, to stay where she was. But she had to look. The beam of her flashlight trembled as she reached the door and shone it through the glass panel. The backyard was a blur of darkness and rain, the trees swaying violently in the wind. Nothing was there. Then, Just as she was about to turn away, a face appeared, pale, hollow-eyed, pressed against the glass. Emily screamed and stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The room was plunged into near-total darkness, save for the occasional flicker of lightning. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she scrambled to grab the flashlight, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. She aimed it back at the door. Nothing. No face. No figure. Just the rain-slicked glass reflecting her own terrified expression. She was shaking all over. Had she imagined it? A trick of the light? Her mind playing games with her? A deep sense of dread settled in her stomach. Then, from behind her, a creak. Emily's blood ran cold. The sound had come from the hallway. Slowly she turned, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The hallway stretched in front of her, leading to her bedroom. Another creak. This time, closer. Her breath hitched. She wasn't alone. She aimed the flashlight down the hall, her pulse thundering in her ears. At first, she saw nothing, just the same empty hallway she had walked through a dozen times today. But then, a shadow moved. Emily's heart nearly stopped. A figure stood just at the edge of the darkness. Too tall, too still. Her voice caught in her throat. The flashlight flickered. For a split second, she saw it clearly. Long, skeletal fingers, sunken eyes, a gaping, unnatural mouth. Then the light went out. The whisper came, cold and close. "You shouldn't be here." Emily bolted. She ran through the house, blindly fumbling for the front door. Her hands shook as she clawed at the lock, her breath coming in desperate, choked sobs. She wrenched the door open and ran out into the freezing rain, not stopping until she reached the road. Her neighbors found her an hour later, drenched, shaking, unable to speak. The police searched the house. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no one inside. But Emily knew what she had seen. And she knew, deep down, it was still in there. Waiting. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the roof and windows as Olivia sat curled up on the couch. The storm had knocked the power out nearly an hour ago, leaving her in flickering candlelight and the soft glow of her phone screen. She tried to focus on reading, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. She lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, nestled between tall, swaying trees. It had been her parents' home before they passed, and, despite its age, she loved it. But tonight, something about it felt different. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows. The darkness outside pressed against the glass, making the inside of the house feel smaller, suffocating. Then she heard it, a sound just beneath the rain, a faint tap, tap, tap at the back door. Olivia froze, her heart hammering. It was probably just a tree branch, or the storm throwing debris against the house. But something about it felt deliberate. She stood, her legs reluctant to move, and grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table. Steeling herself, she walked toward the back door, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The tapping stopped. She swallowed, shining the beam of light through the glass panel of the door. Nothing but darkness and rain. She exhaled, shaking her head. Just her imagination. But as she turned to go back to the living room, tap, tap, tap. The sound came again. Harder this time. Closer. A chill spread through her. She didn't want to look, but she did. And for the briefest moment, she saw it, something pale, standing just beyond the edge of the light. A face. She gasped, stumbling backward, the flashlight shaking in her grip. The face was gone. Olivia's breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away from the door. This wasn't just her imagination. A sudden creak from the hallway made her spin around. She wasn't alone. Her pulse roared in her ears. The hallway stretched in front of her, pitch black beyond the reach of her flashlight. Another creak. Closer this time. She held her breath, listening. The wind shrieked outside, the rain pounded the roof, but underneath it all, she heard breathing. Shallow, ragged, coming from the darkness ahead. A wave of icy terror washed over her. She wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to get out, but her feet were rooted in place. The breathing grew louder. And then, a shadow moved. Slowly, out of the darkness, something stepped forward. Her flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows as she tried to focus the beam, and then she saw it. A figure, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face, oh God, its face. The hollow, gaping mouth, the empty sockets where eyes should be. It took a step toward her. The whisper came, barely audible over the storm. "You shouldn't be here." Olivia's body broke free of the paralysis. She turned and ran. Through the living room, past the flickering candles, her own panicked sobs drowning out the storm. She reached the front door, clawing at the locks, her fingers fumbling in terror. Another whisper. Closer. "You're not alone." She yanked the door open and stumbled into the freezing rain. She ran. She didn't look back, not when she heard the sound of something following, not when she felt the cold breath on her neck. She ran until she reached her neighbor's house, pounding on the door, screaming for help. When they finally opened it, she collapsed inside, gasping, shaking. She tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. The police searched her home. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no one there. But Olivia knew the truth. Something had been in that house with her, and it wasn't gone. It never would be.
Story number 7.
The rain poured relentlessly, a steady drumming against the roof and windows of Mark's small house. The wind howled through the trees surrounding his isolated home, sending icy drafts through the cracks in the old walls. The power had gone out over an hour ago, leaving him with only the dim glow of a single candle and the weak beam of his flashlight. He wasn't afraid of storms. He had spent plenty of nights alone in bad weather. But tonight felt different. The air was heavy, thick with something unseen, something watching. Mark sat on his couch, flipping through an old book to distract himself. His phone was at 10%, useless with no service. He told himself he wasn't uneasy, that the only thing unsettling him was the loneliness of the night. Then he heard it. A faint knock. It was soft, deliberate, just 3 slow taps against the front door. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. He lived miles away from anyone. No one would be out here, especially not in a storm like this. The rain lashed against the windows, the wind shrieking through the trees. He tried to tell himself it was just a branch, just the house settling. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Louder this time. Mark set down the book and grabbed his flashlight, his heart pounding as he stood. The house was silent, save for the storm outside. Taking a slow breath, he moved toward the door, his bare feet silent against the wooden floor. He hesitated, then shone the flashlight through the small peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty. The rain swept across the yard, turning the dirt road leading to his house into thick mud. Still, something didn't feel right. Mark reached for the doorknob but stopped. A sudden wave of nausea rolled over him, a deep, primal instinct screaming at him not to open the door. The candle flickered violently. Then, in the back of the house, another knock. Mark spun around, his stomach twisting. The back door. His skin turned ice cold. There was no way someone could have moved that fast. His grip tightened around the flashlight as he moved toward the kitchen, where the back door stood. The glass panel was streaked with rain, distorting the view outside. He swallowed, hesitated, then lifted the flashlight. For a split second, he saw it. A face. Pale. Hollow-eyed. Pressed against the glass. Mark stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. Then, as another bolt of lightning illuminated the sky, it was gone. The yard was empty. But the doorknob, it was turning. The lock rattled as if something was trying to get inside. Mark bolted. He ran for the front door, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the deadbolt. The house groaned, the wind howling louder, the rain hammering against the walls. Then, a whisper, right behind him. "Let me in." Mark's blood turned to ice. He didn't look, didn't breathe. He yanked the door open and ran into the storm, the cold rain stinging his skin. He didn't stop running until he reached his truck, parked a few yards away. Fumbling with his keys, he threw himself inside and locked the doors. His breath came in ragged gasps as he gripped the steering wheel, his whole body trembling. Then, from the porch, a shadow moved. The figure stood there, just beyond the reach of his headlights, watching, waiting. Mark turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, failed. He swore. Tried again. Nothing. Then a whisper. "You can't leave." The truck's lights flickered. The shadow stepped closer. Mark squeezed his eyes shut, his pulse roaring in his ears. When he opened them again, the figure was gone. The storm raged around him, the trees bending under the wind. But the house was silent, empty, still. He didn't go back inside. He sat in his truck until morning, the first rays of sunlight creeping over the horizon. When he finally found the courage to return to the house, the doors were locked. Everything was exactly as he had left it, except for one thing. On the back door, written in the condensation on the glass, "Next time, don't run." Story the end.
Story number 8.
The rain had been falling steadily for hours, a cold and relentless downpour that turned the world outside into a blur of water and darkness. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of Emma's small cabin on the outskirts of town. She had always loved the sound of rain, but tonight there was something different about it, something unsettling. She sat curled up on her couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping a mug of tea. The power had gone out about an hour ago, plunging the cabin into darkness. She had a few candles lit, their flickering glow casting strange shadows on the walls. Emma wasn't easily scared. She had lived alone for years and was used to the quiet, but tonight the silence felt heavy, suffocating. Then she heard it. A knock. Soft, deliberate. 3 slow taps on the front door. Emma's breath hitched. Her nearest neighbor was over a mile away. No one should be out here, especially not in this weather. She set her mug down carefully, listening. Nothing. Just the wind and the rain. Maybe she imagined it. The storm playing tricks on her. Then it came again. Tap, tap. Louder this time. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She stood, gripping the blanket tightly around her, and moved toward the door. She peered through the peephole. Darkness. The porch light was out, making it impossible to see anything beyond the rain-slicked wood. She hesitated, then reached for the flashlight on the side table. She flicked it on and aimed the beam through the small window beside the door. Nothing. The yard was empty. The dirt path leading up to the house was a mess of mud and puddles, untouched. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. A sudden creak from the back of the house made her spin around. The back door. Her stomach clenched. She wasn't sure if it was the wind, the old wooden frame shifting in the cold, or something else entirely. Slowly, she made her way through the darkened cabin, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. She reached the kitchen where the back door stood. The small window in the center was fogged over from the cold. She hesitated, then raised the flashlight, wiping a clear spot on the glass. Her breath caught in her throat. A face. Pale. Expressionless. Eyes dark and hollow. Pressing against the glass from the outside. Emma stumbled back, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. By the time she grabbed it again and shined the beam toward the door, the face was gone. The yard was empty. But the doorknob, it was moving. The metal rattled, the door shaking slightly as if someone was trying to turn it. Emma ran. She didn't stop to think, didn't hesitate. She bolted through the house, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. She reached the front door, fumbled with the lock, and yanked it open. The storm hit her like a wall, freezing rain, howling wind. She stepped onto the porch, her bare feet sinking into the wet wood. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, searching. Nothing. No footprints. No sign of anyone, just the rain and the wind and the endless trees surrounding the cabin. Then, a whisper. Right behind her. "Don't go." Emma screamed and spun around. No one was there. But the back door, it was wide open, swinging gently in the wind. The candlelight inside flickered, casting shifting shadows on the walls. The air in the house seemed darker now, heavier. Something was in there. Something had let itself in. Emma didn't wait to find out what. She turned and ran down the muddy path, slipping, stumbling, her feet barely carrying her fast enough. She ran until she reached the main road, where headlights finally cut through the storm. Her neighbor, John, nearly skidded to a stop when he saw her, soaked, barefoot, shaking. She told him everything, her words tumbling out between ragged breaths. He called the police. They searched the cabin, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, no one there. But the back door, still swinging open, and on the fogged-up window where she had seen the face, a single word was written: "Stay." Emma never went back. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The rain poured in thick, relentless sheets, drumming against the roof and windows of Sarah's small house. The wind howled through the trees that lined the edge of her property, their skeletal branches scratching against the siding like fingers trying to claw their way inside. The power had gone out nearly an hour ago, leaving her in darkness, save for the dim glow of a single candle flickering on the coffee table. Her phone was at 12%, and the weak signal made it impossible to load anything useful. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to ignore the deep silence that settled over the house in the absence of her usual background noise. No hum of the refrigerator, no quiet whir of the heater, no faint static from the television. Just the sound of the storm and the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. Then came the knock. Soft. Deliberate. 3 slow taps against the front door. Sarah's breath hitched. She lived alone. No one would be visiting her this late, especially not in this weather. She sat frozen, listening. Maybe she had imagined it, just a trick of the storm playing with her nerves. Tap! Tap! Louder this time. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She reached for her phone, her hands shaking. No service. No way to call for help. The wind groaned outside, the rain hammering against the windows. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance. Then, silence. No more knocking. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Maybe whoever it was had left. Maybe it was just the wind rattling something loose. And then, from the back of the house, another knock. Sarah whipped around, her heart slamming against her ribs. The back door. Someone was at the back door. No, that wasn't possible. The backyard was fenced. No one could have moved that fast. The candle on the coffee table flickered violently, the flame twisting in unseen wind. But there were no open windows. She grabbed the flashlight from the couch and stood, moving toward the hallway with slow, careful steps. She reached the kitchen, where the back door was. The rain blurred the glass, making it impossible to see outside. She lifted the flashlight, hesitated, then shone it through the window. Nothing. Only the reflection of her own pale, terrified face staring back at her. She let out a shaky breath, feeling foolish. It had to be the storm. Then her reflection blinked. Sarah's stomach dropped. She hadn't blinked. The thing in the window was not her. It was watching her. And then it moved. Sarah screamed, stumbling backward, her flashlight slipping from her grip and clattering to the floor. Darkness swallowed the room. She fumbled for the flashlight, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she found it and flicked it back on, the figure was gone, but the back door was unlocked. She was sure that she had locked it earlier. The air inside the house had turned ice cold. A soft creak came from the hallway behind her. Sarah turned slowly, the flashlight beam shaking in her grip. The hallway stretched ahead, filled with shadows. Then she heard it. The sound of breathing. Not hers. Deep. Ragged. Right next to her ear, a whisper followed. "You're not alone." Sarah ran. She didn't think, didn't look back. She sprinted for the front door, her hands shaking as she struggled with the lock. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Let me in." The door finally wrenched open, and Sarah bolted into the freezing rain. She ran down the road, barefoot, the wind cutting through her like knives. She didn't stop until she reached her neighbor's house, pounding on the door, sobbing. When they let her in, she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. The police searched her home. No signs of forced entry. No footprints in the mud outside. No one there. But Sarah knew the truth. She had locked that back door. Something had been inside with her, and it was still there. Waiting. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of Daniel's small house as rain pelted the roof in a steady rhythm. The power had gone out over an hour ago, leaving him in near darkness, save for the warm flicker of a candle on the coffee table. He sat on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping the last of his tea. Daniel wasn't afraid of storms. Living alone for years had made him used to nights like this. But tonight felt different. The air in the house was colder than it should have been, the silence heavier. It was the kind of silence that made your skin prickle, that made you feel like you weren't really alone. He glanced at his phone. 5% battery. No service. Typical. Then it happened. A knock. Soft. Deliberate. 3 slow taps on the front door. Daniel's fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. It was almost midnight. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a storm? He stayed still, listening. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind shaking the old wooden frame. Then came another knock. Louder. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. Standing slowly, he grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table and aimed it at the door. He hesitated, then peered through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty. The dirt path leading to his house was slick with mud, untouched. A cold chill crawled up his spine. Just as he was about to turn away, A loud bang came from the back of the house. Daniel jumped, whipping around. Someone or something was at the back door. His grip on the flashlight tightened as he made his way through the house, his bare feet silent against the wooden floor. The candlelight cast eerie shadows along the walls, making the small cabin feel larger, emptier. He reached the kitchen. The back door stood closed, but the old glass window was fogged up from the cold. Daniel swallowed. He wiped a small circle on the glass with his sleeve and shined the flashlight outside. Nothing. Just the rain falling in thick sheets, the trees swaying violently in the wind. Then, just as he exhaled in relief, a face appeared. Pale. Hollow eyes. Lips stretched into a grotesque grin. Daniel stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. The face was still there, but I was staring at him from the other side of the glass. Then, it vanished. The yard was empty again. Daniel's breath came in short, ragged gasps. His skin was ice cold, his body locked in place. Then the doorknob started turning. Slow, deliberate. The lock rattled. Something was trying to come inside. Daniel ran. He didn't stop to think. He bolted from the kitchen through the living room toward the front door. His hands fumbled with the lock, shaking so badly he could barely turn the knob. Then a whisper, right behind him. "Let me in." Daniel's blood turned to ice. He didn't look, didn't breathe. He yanked the door open and ran into the storm, the rain soaking his clothes instantly. He ran down the road, slipping in the mud, barely able to see through the downpour. He didn't stop until he reached his neighbor's house, banging on the door, gasping for breath. When John, his neighbor, finally let him in, Daniel collapsed onto the floor, shaking. The police searched the cabin, no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the mud outside, no one there. But Daniel knew. He had locked that back door. Something had been inside with him, and it was still there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the small, weather-worn cottage nestled on the edge of a dense forest. The rain slammed against the roof in sheets, blurring the line between the dark night and the heavy storm. Inside, the only light came from a flickering candle on the mantel, its glow casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the storm was relentless, the gusts of wind slamming against the trees, making them sway like living creatures. Elena sat curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She had never been fond of the solitude that came with living in this remote cottage, but her job had demanded the move. She had hoped to get used to it, hoped the silence would eventually become comforting. But tonight it felt different. The air felt thick, heavy with something she couldn't put into words. It wasn't the storm, not really. It was something else, something in the way the house creaked, the way the shadows seemed to stretch and shift in the corners. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearing midnight. Time to turn in for the night, she thought, though the idea made her uneasy. The house was old, too old, and though she had grown accustomed to the little creaks and groans that came with the building settling, tonight the sounds felt deliberate, more pronounced. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the open door to the hallway that led to the bedroom. The darkness beyond it felt as though it stretched on forever. Elena had left the door ajar earlier when she went to grab a book, but now it seemed to beckon her. She stood, shivering slightly despite the warmth of the fire, and walked toward the hallway, her feet making soft, hesitant steps against the old floorboards. As she passed by the door, a cold draft rushed over her, making her pause. She frowned. The house had no central heating, but it was odd for it to feel so cold, so suddenly. She peered into the hallway, the darkness almost impenetrable. She could barely make out the outlines of the pictures on the walls, the door at the end of the hall to her bedroom. The unease in her chest grew. Turning away from the hallway, she made her way to the stairs, her feet making an almost inaudible squeak on the worn wooden steps. Her hand grasped the railing as she ascended, but when she reached the top, something made her stop. A feeling, something primal and sharp, like the hairs on the back of her neck standing up, told her to turn around. Slowly, she glanced down the stairs. Nothing. The house was silent. She breathed a sigh of relief and moved into her bedroom, closing the door behind her. The room was small, simple, and familiar. Her bed was neatly made, a pile of books sat on the nightstand, and the window to the outside was cracked open just a little, letting in the cool, damp air. She didn't usually feel afraid here, but tonight, her skin crawled as she closed the window, the storm outside growing louder as the rain began to pound harder against the panes. As she settled into bed, she pulled the covers up to her chin, her eyes darting around the room, trying to shake the unease that had taken hold. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and she closed her eyes, hoping sleep would come quickly. But it didn't. Instead, her mind raced with thoughts of the old house, thoughts of its history, its age, the way it seemed to creak and groan, as if the building itself was alive, breathing in the storm. Suddenly, a loud thump echoed from the hallway. Elena's eyes shot open. Her heart skipped a beat as she lay perfectly still, straining to hear. There was another thump. She was certain it was coming from the direction of the stairs. It wasn't the sound of something falling, but a heavy, deliberate noise, as if someone or something had stepped heavily across the floor. A cold chill swept through the room. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She tried to reason with herself. Maybe it was just the house settling, maybe it was the wind, but the logic didn't make her feel any better. Her gaze flicked toward the door, now closed, but with a sliver of shadow seeping through beneath it. The house was still dead silent, save for the pounding of the rain. Then came another thump, louder this time, right outside her door. Elena's heart hammered in her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, hoping it would stop, but the sound didn't fade. It continued, slow, deliberate, like footsteps pacing back and forth just outside the door. She felt her muscles tense, her body stiff with fear. There was no one else in the house. She was sure of it. But the sound, it was undeniable. Her hand reached for the lamp beside her bed, trembling as she switched it on. The room lit up, but it didn't help the sense of unease that gripped her. The footsteps stopped. Then, to her horror, she heard a whisper, a soft, raspy voice, coming from the hallway. Elena, her breath caught. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't obey. The voice was barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Her name, coming from just outside the door. Elena? It was followed by a slow, dragging sound like someone or something shuffling along the floor. Terror shot through her, and she knew she couldn't stay in the room any longer. With her heart thundering in her chest, she pushed the covers off and scrambled to her feet. But before she could even make it to the door, she froze. There, at the foot of the bed, standing in the shadows, was a figure. A silhouette, tall and gaunt, its form barely visible in the dim light. It stood motionless, its shape almost indistinct, but for the hollow darkness where its face should have been. The air grew frigid, and a sense of overwhelming dread filled the room. Elena's breath became shallow, her chest tight with panic. Elena. The voice again, softer this time, closer. It seemed to emanate from the figure itself, a rasping whisper that scraped at her insides. The figure stepped forward, and in that moment, Elena screamed. Without thinking, she lunged for the door, throwing it open and darting into the hallway. Her feet slipped on the smooth wooden floor as she rushed toward the stairs, but when she reached the top, she stopped dead in her tracks. The stairs, once familiar and comforting, now seemed endless. There was no way out. There was no place safe. From behind her, a cold gust of air swept past her, and she heard the soft shuffle of footsteps once more, but this time, they were right behind her. "Go away!" she screamed, her voice breaking, but the footsteps didn't stop. They came closer. Closer. Her breath came in gasps, her eyes darting around, looking for an escape, but there was none. The wind outside was the only sound, whistling through the cracks in the house, and then, nothing. The silence returned, suffocating her. Slowly, cautiously, Elena turned around, expecting to see the figure right behind her, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty. The stairs stretched out before her, as still and silent as they had been moments ago. Elena's heart was still pounding as she stood there, unsure of what had just happened. Had she imagined it? Was it the storm playing tricks on her mind? She took a hesitant step backward, and another. And then, in the quietest of whispers, just behind her ear, the voice came again. Elena. Story the end.
Story number 12.
The rain had started again. It wasn't a light drizzle, but a heavy, relentless downpour that pelted the windows with an almost aggressive force. The wind howled through the trees outside, and the old house creaked under its pressure. It was the kind of night that made every shadow seem to stretch further, every sound magnified. But for Amelia, it was just another evening. alone in her quiet, rural cottage. She had moved to this remote house a few months ago, trying to escape the chaos of her previous life. The cottage, tucked away on a small hill surrounded by dense woods, had been the perfect getaway. There were no neighbors for miles, and the solitude was soothing, at least most of the time. Tonight, though, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. The storm outside made the world feel cut off, distant. She had always been a fan of the rain, but there was something about it tonight, something different. Amelia sat by the fire, a mug of hot tea warming her hands as the flames crackled and popped. She had a book open in her lap, though she wasn't really reading. Her mind kept wandering, returning again and again to the strange sensation that she was being watched. She shook it off, telling herself it was just the storm playing tricks on her mind. But then the power flickered. The lights dimmed, then came back on. But for a moment, the house was cast in an eerie silence. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, all of it disappeared. She set her mug down and stood up, walking to the window. The rain lashed against the glass, the wind bending the trees like they were made of paper. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, something felt wrong. She turned away from the window and walked back into the living room. The fire was still burning brightly, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. It was warm, comforting, but the air around her felt cold now, unnaturally so. The silence was the worst part, the kind that presses in on you, making you feel like you're not alone. She heard a faint sound like a creak and stopped dead in her tracks. Another creak, this time louder. Her heart skipped. Her eyes flicked to the hallway, just visible from where she stood. The old house had its quirks, and the settling of the wood was not unusual, but the sound didn't feel right tonight. It felt deliberate. The wind rattled the windows, making the sound even more unnerving. She took a step toward the hallway, each footfall hesitant, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She didn't want to go, but something was pulling her forward. Curiosity, fear, or maybe both. As she reached the hallway, she paused. The old wooden floors creaked under her weight. The house seemed to be holding its breath. She swallowed, trying to steady herself. There was nothing in the hallway. No signs of anyone, no movement, except for the door at the end. It was slightly ajar. Amelia frowned. She had been in that room earlier, checking for drafts. She knew she had closed the door. It had been shut tight, just as it always was, but now it stood open, a sliver of darkness waiting for her. A cold shiver ran down her spine, and she felt a sudden compulsion to move toward it, to look inside. She took one slow, careful step, then another, until she was standing right in front of the door. Her hand hovered over the knob. For a moment she hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the air around her, thick with the weight of something unseen. Finally, with a tremor in her fingers, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was empty. It was the guest bedroom, seldom used, and yet always kept neat. The moonlight from the stormy night filtered through the window, casting pale blue shadows on the walls. Everything was just as it should be, or at least it should have been. But something was off. The room felt colder than the rest of the house, the temperature dropping sharply as she stepped inside. She closed the door behind her, though it did nothing to ease the strange chill that clung to the air. Amelia's breath came in visible puffs now, and the back of her neck prickled with a strange sense of being observed. She looked around again, just to reassure herself. The bed, the dresser, the vanity, nothing had been disturbed. But then she noticed something. On the far side of the room, near the corner, a chair sat facing the wall. She knew it hadn't been there before. It was as though someone had placed it deliberately, facing away from her, its back turned. She stepped closer, and then from behind her, the faintest whisper. Amelia. She froze, her blood running cold. The voice was faint, soft, almost like a sigh. But she was alone. She knew she was alone. Amelia. It came again, louder this time, as though it was right next to her ear. She whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was empty, the door closed, the air still. There was no one behind her, but she couldn't shake the feeling. The voice, it was real. She had heard it. Amelia. This time, the whisper seemed to echo through the room, filling every corner with its breathless urgency. She turned back to the chair, her eyes wide with fear. There, in the dim light, something was moving. The chair, just a slight shift, but enough to make her pulse race. The seat was rocking back and forth, ever so slightly, as if someone had just risen from it. She gasped, stumbling back toward the door. Her mind raced. Was it a prank? Had someone gotten into the house? But the house was locked. The windows were bolted shut. The chair rocked again, and this time it wasn't a subtle shift. It was a full, deliberate motion, as though someone had just sat back down in it, and the sound of creaking wood filled the room, followed by another whisper. Amelia. With a choked scream, she flung open the door and fled down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the sound of footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate, echoing in the stillness. She didn't dare look back. She raced into the living room and slammed the door behind her, her hands trembling as she locked it. The firelight flickered, casting chaotic shadows on the walls. The wind continued to howl outside, but in the house, it felt as though the world had gone deathly silent once again. Amelia sank to the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was still, but the air felt thick with something she couldn't name. The whispering voices had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. It hung over her like a suffocating weight. And then, just as she thought she might lose her mind, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. The house was plunged into darkness. From the corner of the room, a faint shadow stirred. Amelia. Story the end.